Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The morning in Surulere unfurled like a carefully folded wrapper, slow and deliberate, bright with the soft hum of traffic and the first chatter of hawkers whose voices braided the air into a familiar lullaby. Clara James opened the flower shop before the sun found its full voice. A key turned, a bell chimed, and the perfume of damp soil lifted like a whispered hymn from the buckets where roses drank in silence. She moved with the patience of a choir mistress, arranging lilies like promises and pruning hibiscus as though they were stubborn sentences that needed gentler punctuation. Outside, boys pushed wheelbarrows stacked with oranges the color of new hope. The street twitched awake one kiosk at a time, a dance Lagos knows by heart. Clara spoke to her flowers the way old women speak to distant grandchildren, softly, amused, certain they would bloom if attended with tenderness. She tied twine around a bouquet of yellow marigolds for a tailor who never paid on time, yet always left blessings at the door, then swept the floor so meticulously that the broom sang against the tiles. When the first rain of the day skirted the roof in a scatter of silver feet, she stood still and listened, feeling as if the sky were rinsing its face before market. There was a calmness to her routine that made people think she had no storms of her own, but calmness is sometimes a mask worn by oceans with quiet teeth. She kept a small notebook tucked beneath the till, where bits of phrases waited like seeds, for Mama's birthday, for the pastor's wife, for the baby yet to arrive, words that would later bloom into arrangements. If the city was a restless drum, she gave it a softer beat, a room where petals negotiated the chaos in one. She trusted mornings the way some trust beads and amulets, not as spells but as touchstones. In Lagos, the day can roar like a lion and purr like a kitchen cat in the span of a breath. Clara steered between both with the ease of a patient canoeist, paddling where the current nudged, lowering her head where the wind spoke in riddles. Her heart held a small room for longing, a neat corner swept free of dust where a future might one day sit and take tea, and she watered that room with the same care she gave her ferns, never drowning it, never letting it dry to crackle. People came and went, and the shop kept its gentle pulse, a sanctuary against the unruly shrug of the city. When the light shifted and afternoon stretched like a lazy cat on tiled floors, she lifted the blinds and let Lagos see itself mirrored in the glossy leaves, a quiet invitation to come in and breathe. Michael Hart arrived on a rain-sliced Tuesday that smelt of wet dust and boiled corn, a carpenter whose shoulders carried sawdust the way Harmattan carries secrets, everywhere, soft and persistent. He pushed the door and the bell tinkled, a small silver bird startled into flight, and his grin arrived before his words, warm enough to melt the puddles off his sleeves. He was the kind of man who looked at wood and saw furniture, who looked at scraps and saw a table where laughter could take its shoes off, who spoke as if nails obeyed him out of respect, not force. When he shook his umbrella, rain pebbled the doormat like beads escaping a careless wrist, and he apologized to the marigolds as though he had bumped a friend in a crowded danfo. Clara watched him move with that soft efficiency artisans carry like a second language, how he handled the vase, how he read the room, how his eyes took measure without a ruler. He asked for sunflowers, the kind that stare God in the face, and something in his voice made the air stand taller. They talked about weather as if it were a cousin who visited unannounced, about the road to Yaba, where the traffic eats time and leaves bones, about how a properly sanded plank feels like new skin. He laughed with his whole chest, the way some people cook, with intention, with salt, with a willingness to let heat do its work. When he left, the room seemed to miss him, the bell performing a small, lonely echo. He returned 2 days later for a bouquet, that looks like Sunday morning, and stayed long enough to help her adjust a crooked shelf that had been stubborn since April. He didn't make a meal out of his kindness. He served it like palm oil in a small dish, useful, deliberate, without fuss. Clara wasn't the type to be swept by the wide broom of romance, but she noticed a steadiness in him, a hinge that didn't creak, a door that closed without slamming. They began to share little Lagos tales, the pepper that embarrassed a pot of stew, the bus that promised Ojalegba then pivoted to Mushin, the generator that coughed like an old uncle at midnight, and the laughter laced their days together in a way that felt unplanned and right. Sometimes love arrives like thunder, sometimes it arrives like a carpenter, measuring twice and cutting once. Clara felt a small alignment inside her, like a shelf finally level, and wondered whether this was how the heart says yes without raising its voice. Their becoming was not a sprint, but a steady walk down streets that had learned their names, a gradual weaving of hours and errands that made the city feel less like a maze and more like a domestic animal that could be coaxed with calm hands. They rode danfos where conductors barked prices as though numbers were goats to be bullied, and they leaned into each other at potholes that tossed the bus like an impatient cook stirring swallow. At Ojalegba they ate suya that wept fire and joy in equal measure, and he wiped pepper from her lip with the corner of a tissue, a gesture so small it echoed for days. On Sundays they visited a quiet church near Anakin, where the choir sang like rain describing a roof, and afterward they wandered through stalls that sold records and books, their fingers grazing spines like old friends greeting by the gate. Michael took her to his workshop in Yaba, a place that smelled of turpentine and ambition, where planks slept like crocodiles along the wall, and shavings lay on the floor like confetti from a party wood had thrown for itself. He showed her a chair he was making for a woman in Acadia who wanted to feel queenly, but not too queenly, and they laughed at the balance of it, the way desire can be particular and still be a river. He asked about her arrangements, and she told him the alchemy of pairing yellow with mercy, white with apology, purple with the kind of pride that bows without bending. They traded recipes and memories, insults for mosquitoes and praises for evening wind, proverbs that fit the tongue like cola nut. Measure your cloth, greet the road before you walk it, when a pot sings, listen for the heat. His mother called from Benin City, and he switched into a softer voice. Her uncle rang from Enugu, and Clara's LRS and RRS danced like cousins at a wedding. They joked about running away to Abeokuta, to a slower sky where the day minded its business and the night minded its silence, about raising a tiny garden with tomato plants that gossip in the sun. Nothing rushed. Even their silences had manners, resting comfortably on sofas of shared air. In those weeks, Lagos behaved like a generous landlord, allowing them small mercies, a traffic-free stretch, a seat by the window, a rain that arrived after they were already indoors. Clara found herself sleeping a little deeper, laughing a little quicker, planning a little braver, and if fear sidled up like a neighbor asking for salt, she lent it a pinch and closed the door gently. Michael fit into her hours the way a good song fits an evening. Not too loud, not too eager, just enough melody to make washing plates feel like choreography. They were not yet forever, but they were certainly a road that made sense underfoot, and sometimes the body recognizes the map before the mind reads it. When the first shadow fell, it did not announce itself with drum or trumpet. It came the way harmattan sneaks, quiet, patient, a thin dryness at the edge of breath. Michael began to tire easily, a weight behind his eyes as if someone had switched his blood with molasses. He dismissed it at first, those little naps that crept up like cats and curled at his neck, the thirst that pitched camp and refused eviction, the headaches that arrived like uninvited uncles at Christmas. Clara, who watched like a gardener watches, noticed the slow wilt. She started adding more greens to their stew, bringing him zobo without too much sugar, teasing him into rest. When he finally agreed to see a doctor in Yaba, the clinic smelled like new paint and worry. Tests followed, each one a small toll at a bridge they hadn't planned to cross, each needle a syllable in a sentence they didn't want to read. The day a nurse called them into a room painted the color of polite lies, the air thinned. The doctor's words came dressed in caution, kidney function, creatinine levels, dialysis, transplant, and they sat like stones in the mouth, unchewed, unswallowed. Michael tried to laugh it off, but the laugh was fragile, a glass bird hesitant to fly. Clara reached for his hand, and found it colder than usual, so she wrapped both of hers around it, and made a little house of skin and resolve. Love, when cornered, grows teeth. Hers grew quietly. She learned the vocabulary of lab results the way a child learns proverbs, by repetition, by need, by fire under the pot. At night, she listened to his breathing as if counting coins, making sure none had rolled under the bed. In the mornings, she straightened the shop's vases with a sharper eye, as if symmetry could bribe fate. They spoke in practicalities because panic can be a poor storyteller. Appointments, second opinions, the best days to travel to Abadan where a specialist lived, how to keep work going while the body negotiated with itself. Underneath the planning, fear lay like a coiled rope, but they stepped around it kindly, placing their feet where courage told them to. When the specialist recommended further evaluation in Abadan, Clara packed a small bag with more faith than clothing and promised herself she would carry this story like a calabash balanced, steady head, steady steps, steady breath. In Lagos, news moves faster than harmattan fire, yet she held it close, not as a secret, but as a tender flame shielding itself from wind. The road to Abaddon in the early light looked like a strip of earth that had swallowed rain and decided to keep the taste. The journey began with a bus whose seats sagged like tired hammocks, the engine's hum carrying them past roadside stalls that still yawned in the half-light. Clara sat by the window, Michael beside her, the scent of roasted plantain sneaking in from somewhere along the way. The fields were green enough to make a man believe the world could start over at any moment, and the occasional herd of goats moved with the arrogance of creatures that had never been late to anything. She tried to focus on the scenery, to let the rhythm of passing trees and low hills wash away the weight in her chest, but each glance at Michael reminded her of the errand before them. His face, once animated like a storyteller's hands, had grown paler, a quiet surrender to the illness that was drawing lines across him like a cartographer charting a slow disaster. By the time they entered the city, with its red roofs tilting toward the sky and its streets humming with a language of trade and urgency, Clara's resolve had hardened into something she could almost taste. She would see this through. She would match her steps to the pace of his recovery, however long the road demanded. In the taxi from the park to the hospital, they passed the university gates, the laughter of students spilling onto the street like a reminder that life had other shapes. A preacher's voice rose from a nearby junction, his words slicing through the din of honking cars, and Clara found herself wondering if faith was something you carried like a talisman, or something that carried you without your asking. When they reached the hospital, the gates opened to a compound that smelt of iodine and wet leaves, and she tightened her grip on Michael's arm as though the ground beneath them had grown uncertain. Inside the hospital, corridors stretched in both directions like rivers without visible ends, lined with doors that seemed to guard their own quiet storms. Nurses moved briskly, their shoes whispering against the tiles, their faces arranged in expressions that were professional but not unkind. They checked in at the front desk, the clerk sliding forms toward Clara with the detachment of someone who had seen too many signatures that carried too much weight. She signed her name where indicated, her handwriting steady despite the pulse that beat in her ears. Michael was led to an examination room, and she followed, noting the way each step echoed just enough to remind her of the emptiness between them and answers. The doctor who entered wore glasses that magnified his eyes, giving him the look of someone always on the verge of seeing something deeper. He reviewed Michael's file, asked questions that dug into their routines, their family histories, their diets, as though each answer might hold a hidden key. Blood was drawn, urine collected, machines beeped in measured intervals. Clara watched the needle slide into Michael's arm, her breath catching in a rhythm she could not control. The doctor explained the next steps, matching tests, tissue typing, and a series of evaluations to ensure both donor and recipient could withstand the surgery. His tone was measured, careful not to stir unnecessary panic, yet every word seemed to settle into Clara's skin like small stones. When they left the room, Michael squeezed her hand, a gesture that tried to bridge the gap between gratitude and fear. In the waiting area, she counted the chairs, then the ceiling fans, then the people coming in and out, as though keeping track of something tangible might keep her from thinking about the invisible. The days in Abaddon became a slow rotation of tests and consultations, each one a small ritual in the unfolding drama. Mornings began early, the air cool and damp, the hospital cafeteria offering tea that tasted faintly of metal and bread that resisted the teeth. Michael tired easily, his laughter now softer, like an echo from another time, but he still found ways to tease her when the moments allowed. Once, while waiting for an ultrasound, he pointed at a poster on the wall showing a healthy kidney beside a diseased one and whispered, "Mine probably looks like the one that failed to pay rent." She laughed despite herself, the sound feeling both borrowed and returned at once. The tests for compatibility required patience, blood drawn, compared, analyzed, antigens examined like suspects in a crime. Clara met other patients in the corridors, faces that carried their own private weather, some bright with hope, others clouded with resignation. She spoke to a woman from Eloreen who was donating to her younger brother, and they shared a brief conversation about courage, though neither of them used the word. Afternoons were spent in consultation rooms, doctors explaining the risks in careful, looping sentences, sometimes pausing to let the air absorb the weight before continuing. Clara nodded, asked questions, made notes she would read again at night in their guesthouse room. The evenings in Abaddon were quiet, the streets settling into themselves after the day's labor, and she would sit by the window, watching headlights trace slow lines against the walls, feeling the distance from Lagos as both a relief and a burden. It was during one of these evenings that the seed of doubt began to stir in her, not as a storm, but as a whisper she could almost ignore. She had never questioned her decision to step forward, had not allowed herself to imagine a future where she might say no. Yet there were moments, brief, like shadows passing over water, when she wondered about the cost. Not just the physical toll, though the doctors had explained it plainly, but the way such an act would reshape the balance between them. Would gratitude sour into guilt? Would she find herself in debt to a feeling that had once been freely given? She pushed these thoughts aside each time they arose, folding them away like unwanted receipts. In the hospital, Michael's eyes would follow her when she entered a room, and in them she saw both the boyish charm that had drawn her in and a weariness that seemed older than either of them. The matching results were expected within a week, the final step before scheduling the surgery. The doctor spoke with cautious optimism. They were likely compatible. Clara nodded, her face a calm mask, though inside she felt as if she were standing on the edge of a wide river, unsure if the opposite bank was solid ground or just another stretch of water. Each night, as the ceiling fan clicked in uneven intervals, she told herself she was ready. She told herself this was love. She told herself there was no reason to doubt. And each morning, she rose and followed Michael to the hospital, her steps in time with his, their shadows stretching long in the Abaddon sun. The night before the surgery arrived without fanfare, the city outside dimming into the sort of quiet that never truly belonged to Abaddon but visited it now and then, like a distant cousin dropping by unannounced. The hospital corridors exhaled their day's work into a stillness that felt almost rehearsed, nurses moving softly as though afraid to wake the sleeping air. Clara and Michael had been given a small private room with a single bed for him and a narrow couch where she could stretch out if she wished, though she rarely did. He had drifted into sleep not long after the evening meal, exhaustion pulling him under with the slow inevitability of a canoe settling into water. His breathing was even but shallow, each rise and fall of his chest a quiet reminder of the fragile thread holding him here. Clara sat at the edge of the couch with her back against the wall, her eyes not on him but on the muted television fixed high in the corner, where a news anchor spoke to an audience she could neither hear nor care about. The weight of the day's consultations still clung to her, the doctor's final explanations looping in her mind. The anesthesia, the incisions, the hours it might take, the days of recovery. She had thought the night would be long because of nerves, but there was something else humming beneath her skin now, a faint, uneasy rhythm that felt out of place. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was the natural fear that comes before something irreversible, the mind's way of testing the heart's resolve. But there was no denying the way her thoughts seemed to circle, restless as a moth around a dim light, unwilling to land. On the low table beside the couch lay Michael's phone, its screen dark, the charger coiled beside it like a sleeping snake. She had seen him fiddling with it earlier, typing in quick bursts before setting it down when the nurse arrived with his medication. He had asked her to plug it in for him, his tone casual, but now, sitting in the muted glow of the room, she remembered the odd look in his eyes when he'd handed it over, as if there was something unsaid between the gesture and the request. It was a thought she might have dismissed on any other night, but the unease inside her seemed to tug at it like a loose thread. When the phone buzzed for the first time, she ignored it. The second buzz came a few minutes later, followed by a third, and something in her stilled. Without fully deciding, she reached for it, the way one might reach for an object in a dream, knowing it doesn't belong to them, yet unable to resist. The screen lit up, and there it was, a message preview with words that felt like cold water down her back. "I can't wait until you're mine completely." The sender's name, Vanessa, registered a beat later, a name she knew only in passing, from the bakery near her flower shop in Lagos where they had once exchanged polite hellos. Her thumb hovered over the screen, her heart pounding a rhythm that didn't match the stillness of the room. She could have set the phone back down, could have pretended she hadn't seen it, but the door between her and the truth was now open, and it was too late to close it without looking inside. The conversation unfolded in a scroll of words that sliced cleanly through the trust she had carried. There were messages from weeks ago, even months, conversations that had begun as something playful and edged into something far more intimate. Phrases that stung, plans for after the surgery, references to Clara not as a person but as an obstacle, talk of starting over in Abuja where no one knew them, Vanessa's laughing declarations that she could be patient if it meant having Michael whole and free. There were photographs too, some taken in places she recognized, Jabi Lake, a small cafe near Maitama, others in rooms she didn't know, their faces close, their smiles unguarded in a way that no accident could explain. Clara read until the words blurred, until the lines between anger and disbelief tangled into something sharp and unwieldy inside her. Each message felt like a hand pulling at the foundation she'd built, the one that had brought her here to Abaddon, ready to trade a piece of her own body for the chance to see him live. Her breathing quickened, but she made no sound. Michael slept on, unaware that the floor beneath them had shifted, that the quiet hum of the night had been replaced in her chest by something heavier. She set the phone down gently, the act deliberate, as if roughness might make the truth more real than it already was. She didn't cry, not then. Instead, she rose from the couch and walked to the window, drawing the curtain back just enough to let the city's faint light spill in. Abaddon's skyline at night was no grandeur, just scattered lamps and the dim outlines of buildings resting from the day, but it was enough to anchor her to the moment. She stood there for a long while, the cool glass against her forehead, letting the sounds from outside, distant motorbikes, a barking dog, the faint call of someone selling suya, thread into the silence of the room. The betrayal sat inside her like a stone dropped in deep water, its ripples reaching into places she had not yet dared to name. She thought of the journey from Lagos, the long days of tests, the way she had carried his fear alongside her own, believing that love made such burdens lighter. Now it seemed that same love had been a blindfold, and she was only just learning to see in the dark. Her mind moved quickly, the way it does when pain sharpens its edges, and she began to think not of confrontation, but of choice. Her choice, the one the doctors had reminded her of at every step. The surgery wasn't until tomorrow. There was still time. She let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward the couch, the air in the room different now, charged with a quiet resolve she hadn't expected to find tonight. Michael stirred slightly in his sleep, but she didn't move toward him. Instead, she lowered herself into the chair beside the couch, folded her arms, and sat, the night stretching ahead like a road she knew she would not walk the same way come morning. The hours after midnight moved like thick syrup, slow and deliberate, trapping Clara in a space where thought and memory blended into one heavy current. The narrow hospital chair pressed into her spine, and the air was heavy with the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to everything like a stubborn memory. She kept her eyes open, watching the wall clock's hand drag itself forward, but in her mind she was somewhere else entirely. Scenes replayed in fragments, Michael laughing across a bowl of pepper soup in Ojalegba, his hands sawdust-dusted in his workshop in Yaba, the way he once walked her home under a leaking umbrella in Suralere. Each memory now had a shadow clinging to it, a distortion she couldn't peel away. Betrayal has a strange way of stealing the color from even the brightest days. The laughter stayed, but its warmth had been leached out, leaving only the echo. She shifted slightly, feeling the stiffness in her neck, and told herself she should rest, if only to face the morning without showing the cracks inside her. But rest refused her like an insulted guest, standing at the threshold with arms folded. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the words on that phone screen, the ones she hadn't imagined, the ones that didn't flinch from their cruelty. And beneath the sting of those words lay something colder, a realization that while she had been preparing to give, Michael had been preparing to leave. That knowledge settled into her bones, not as fire, but as ice, numbing parts of her she thought unshakable. By the time the first hints of dawn slid through the window, painting the pale walls with a reluctant light, Clara felt as if she had already lived a full day in her mind. Michael stirred on the bed, his body adjusting to wakefulness with the sluggishness of someone who expected the day to be about care, not confrontation. She rose quietly, stepping into the small adjoining bathroom, splashing her face with cold water until her reflection looked steady enough to wear in public. The decision she had been circling all night was now sitting clearly in front of her, no longer dressed in doubt. She could not, and would not, give her kidney to a man who had made her body part of a private transaction for his future with someone else. The choice was not vengeance, it was preservation, and there was a difference she could feel even if she could not fully name it. When she returned to the room, Michael smiled faintly, his voice still thick with sleep as he asked if she had rested. She didn't answer the question. Instead, she said the doctor would be along soon for final preparations. Her tone was even, her expression unreadable, but she noticed the way his gaze lingered on her a fraction longer, as if something in her had shifted during the night. She moved past him without explanation, pulling a small notebook from her bag, and began to write a few lines. Her thoughts condensed into words she might need later, the kind that could anchor her if anyone questioned her decision. Outside, the hospital's early rhythm was beginning, The clatter of trays, the murmur of nurses exchanging shifts, the low hum of generators turning over. She could hear it all, but she kept her eyes on the page, each word a step away from the place she had been last night. When the doctor arrived with the nurse, holding the familiar stack of consent forms, Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing in, but she stood her ground. Michael shifted slightly in the bed, clearing his throat as if to smooth over the tension he couldn't quite name. The doctor began to explain the process again, how the anesthesiologist would meet with them shortly, how the surgical team was already prepped, how everything was on schedule. Clara listened without interruption, nodding when it seemed polite, until the pen was placed in her hand. She held it for a moment, the plastic barrel warm from the nurse's fingers, and then she placed it gently back on the table. "I won't be signing," she said, her voice calm, unshaken. The words seemed to hang in the air for a beat too long. Michael blinked, confusion flickering across his face before something sharper edged in, panic, disbelief. "Clara, what are you talking about? You've come this far." She cut him off softly but with finality. "Maybe Vanessa can help you instead." The silence that followed was deep enough to hear the ticking of the wall clock, the soft scrape of the nurse shifting her stance. The doctor's eyes moved from Clara to Michael, assessing the shift in the room, but said nothing yet. Michael began to stammer, his voice cracking around the beginnings of explanations, but she shook her head. "No, there's nothing to explain." She slid the notebook toward the doctor, the photographs of the messages neatly tucked inside, the proof that her decision was not rash but rooted in truth. The nurse's gaze faltered, the doctor's mouth set in a thin line, and Michael's face drained of the little color it had left. The pen remained untouched on the table. The next hour unfolded in a blur of administrative procedures, yet Clara experienced each step with a sharp awareness, as if she had stepped outside herself to watch. The consent form was removed from the file, replaced with a note about patient refusal, and the surgical schedule adjusted. A quiet conversation between the doctor and the hospital's ethics officer took place in the corner, their low voices deliberate. Michael sat hunched on the bed, no longer speaking, his eyes fixed on the floor as though it might offer him a path out of the moment. Clara gathered her bag without haste, checking its contents like someone preparing for a simple errand rather than the dismantling of a life she had built. When the nurse returned with a discharge form for her to sign, she did so without hesitation, the ink flowing cleanly onto the paper as though it, too, understood the necessity. Walking out of the room, she felt the shift in her step, not lighter exactly, but surer, the way one walks after deciding not to cross a bridge that was already burning. In the corridor, she passed a woman speaking softly to her husband in Hausa, their closeness a reminder of what she had once believed she and Michael shared. She didn't flinch. The hospital gates opened to the morning air, the scent of fried akra drifting from a nearby stall, and for the first time in days, she felt the breath in her lungs expand without the press of unspoken fear. The city was already alive around her, its noise and movement indifferent to her private turning point, and she welcomed the anonymity of it. Somewhere behind her, in a room she would not return to, Michael was left to reckon with the gap she had chosen to leave. The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper, a scent that seemed to belong not just to the hospital, but to every decision ever made within its walls. Clara followed the nurse into a small administrative office, her steps steady, her bag tucked under her arm like something she was guarding. The air in the room was still, the blinds half drawn so that thin stripes of sunlight lay across the desk, and an ethics officer sat behind it with the deliberate composure of someone trained to hear hard truths without flinching. Michael was brought in a moment later, his hospital gown hanging loose on his shoulders, eyes restless. He looked first at the officer, then at Clara, as though searching for a gap in her resolve. She sat down without waiting for an invitation, placing her small notebook on the table, the weight of it more symbolic than physical. Michael started speaking quickly, words rolling out like someone trying to patch a roof during a storm. He spoke about their history, the good moments, the ways she had been his anchor. Clara listened, not as someone preparing to be persuaded, but as someone cataloging every attempt to rewrite what she had already read in plain text. When the officer asked her to explain, she did so with precision, describing the messages she'd found, the tone of those exchanges, the timeline that ran parallel to the trust she thought they'd been building. She didn't raise her voice. The steadiness in her tone was its own kind of verdict. Michael's face shifted between disbelief and the faint smile of a man who thinks charm might still open locked doors. But charm, she thought, was a currency she no longer accepted. The officer scribbled notes, occasionally lifting his gaze to study the expressions in front of him. When he asked whether she still wished to proceed with the donation, Clara simply said, "No," the word falling into the space like a stone into deep water. There was no ripple, only finality. Outside the office, the day was already alive with the shuffle of nurses, the slow roll of food carts, the murmurs of patients moving between wards. Clara walked to the billing section to retrieve the papers confirming her withdrawal from the procedure. The receptionist, a woman with a bright headscarf and an efficient smile, searched through a folder and pulled out a file with Clara's name. As she scanned the contents, a crease formed between her brows, and she turned the page as if confirming something twice. "Madam," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "about the preoperative caregiver fund." She rotated the document so it faced Clara. The form listed Clara as the applicant, requesting a sizable allowance for recovery and relocation. At the bottom was a signature, her name, but not her hand. The loops were wrong, the pressure too heavy, the confidence borrowed. Clara stared at it, not with the shock of someone blindsided, but with the slow recognition of a truth she had already suspected was deeper than she wanted to admit. She asked when it had been filed. The date matched the afternoon she'd stepped out to buy bread at the gate kiosk. The receptionist called a supervisor, a man in a dark tie who handled the papers as if their weight might increase with time. He compared her real signature from the consent forms with the one on the loan request. The forgery wasn't even clever, it was bold. Within minutes, hospital protocol unfurled. Copies were made, a report was logged, and the security office was notified. When Michael was brought in, his eyes were already defensive. He started talking before anyone could ask a question, stringing together words about helping her prepare for life after the surgery, about taking steps she hadn't had the energy to take herself. The supervisor listened with the patience of a man who had heard too many rehearsed speeches. In the end, the loan request was frozen, the bank liaison alerted, and the documents filed as evidence. Clara signed the only form she had touched all day, her own statement, in her own neat hand, every letter deliberate. News travels differently inside a hospital. It doesn't race, it seeps, finding its way into break rooms, past vending machines, into the folds of whispered conversations between nurses. By midday, Clara noticed more glances than usual, some curious, some quietly approving, some simply measuring her as if she were an unfamiliar patient. She stepped away from the main corridors and found her way to the hospital chapel, a small white room with wooden pews and the faint smell of candle wax. A cleaner moved slowly along the aisle with a mop, pausing to greet her. Clara chose the back bench and sat, not to pray exactly, but to gather the fragments of her composure into something whole enough to carry home. The air was cooler here, the kind of cool that asks nothing of you. She thought about the days leading to this point, the bus ride from Lagos, the consultations, the late-night discovery of the messages, and felt each memory settle into its place like stones in a path. A counselor, having been briefed by the ethics officer, appeared at the door and asked softly if she wanted to talk. Clara agreed. In a small adjoining room, she recounted the story in full, not rushing, not sparing details, speaking in a way that made the counselor's pen pause now and then. They discussed next steps, reporting the forgery to the police, alerting her bank to safeguard her accounts, keeping all identity documents within reach at all times. These weren't just suggestions, they were tools, and Clara took them as such. By the time she left the chapel, the noise of the hospital no longer felt like an intrusion, but like proof that life, indifferent and unbroken, was still moving. When she returned to the ward for her belongings, Michael was waiting. His posture was different now, shoulders slightly caved, voice lowered. He tried a softer tone, speaking about fear, about desperation, about making mistakes under the pressure of survival. Clara listened without offering the warmth of eye contact, letting the words wash past her like rain on a roof she no longer lived under. When he mentioned the times they had shared, the markets and bus rides and laughter that once curled into their days, she didn't interrupt, but neither did she invite him to believe those memories were currency enough to buy back her trust. She told him plainly that this was not about love lost, but about the ground beneath it being dug out without her consent. "You don't touch a person's name," she said, and the sentence hung there unchallenged. A nurse came in then, clipboard in hand, asking if she needed help to the gate. Clara smiled faintly and said no. She walked out with her bag light on her shoulder, sending messages from her phone as she went, to her bank manager, to a friend with a reliable police contact, to her landlord in Suralere. By the time she stepped into a waiting taxi, Lagos felt closer, like the end of a long exhale. At a red light, she bought a bag of groundnuts from a street hawker and chewed slowly, the salt sitting firm on her tongue. The road ahead was hers now, and she would walk it without the weight of someone else's shadow at her heels. The city received her like it always did, without ceremony but with the small mercies of familiarity. Lagos had a way of letting people disappear into its fold, each street a braid of noise and color that could hide a soul until it was ready to be seen again. Clara stepped down from the taxi in Suralire as the sun folded itself into the early evening haze, the air warm with the scent of roasted corn and the faint perfume of rain that had passed earlier. The flower shop was still as she had left it, the keys fitting the lock as though they had been waiting for her fingers alone. Inside, the air was stale but not unkind, the petals in the buckets bending slightly from days without her care, like children peering toward the sound of a familiar voice. She moved through the space slowly, touching stems, adjusting vases, and letting the simple work draw her mind back into her body. On the counter sat a delivery note from 3 days ago, tucked under a small paperweight shaped like a seashell, and beside it, a single unopened envelope without a return address. She didn't need to open it to know the handwriting was Michael's. The loops and slants pressed too hard into the paper told their own story. She left it there, a reminder that the past was still somewhere outside, pacing, but it would not be invited in tonight. Instead, she brewed tea in the small kettle at the back, the steam curling upward like it was carrying away the last of Abaddon's air from her lungs. As the street outside shifted toward night, hawkers packing up, children clattering home with school bags bouncing on their backs, she stood at the doorway and watched, not feeling apart from it, but not fully in it either. Healing, she realized, was not a sprint toward forgetting. It was a long walk in shoes that must be broken in again. Days fell into rhythm, each one folding neatly into the next. Morning began with the sound of shutters lifting, letting in the pale gold of sunrise that stroked the shop's shelves and found the veins in the leaves. Clara worked without the urgency she once carried. Her movements were measured, each bouquet arranged not as a transaction, but as a quiet conversation between color and feeling. Customers returned one by one, some asking softly if she had been away, others pretending not to notice her absence but lingering a little longer by the counter. The gossip from Abaddon, carried in whispers and phone calls, had found its way into some ears, but Lagos was a city too busy to hold on to another person's storm for long. People bought flowers for birthdays, for apologies, for graves, and she tied their choices with ribbon, her hands steady even when the stories behind the purchases brushed against her own. At night, she closed the shop and walked the few streets home, sometimes stopping for puff-puff from a woman whose laughter came free with every paper bag. On Sundays, she visited her aunt in Enugu by phone, their conversations winding through recipes, news from old neighbors, and the soft admonitions that only older relatives could give without being unwelcome. Through it all, the thought of Michael no longer sat like a stone in her chest. It was more like a pebble in a jar, still there, but small, moved only when she shook the container herself. There were moments, while watering the lilies or trimming the stubborn thorns from roses, when she thought of the road she had chosen not to walk, and each time, she felt the same quiet confirmation. She had not just stepped away from harm, she had stepped toward herself. One afternoon, while rearranging chrysanthemums in the display window, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end belonged to a hospital counselor from Jos, speaking in the careful cadence of someone who knew that news could be heavy even if it wasn't bad. There was a woman there in need of a transplant, the counselor explained, and Clara's compatibility tests from Abaddon had placed her on a list of potential paired donors. It was an invitation, not a demand, the voice assured her. There would be no pressure. Clara stood with one hand on the vase, the flowers stilling in the water, her mind unspooling the thought slowly. She could picture the ward, the quiet desperation in the air, the eyes of someone waiting for a stranger to choose them. But she could also picture her own body as a house, the walls holding firm, the rooms intact after a storm. This time, she would not walk in blindfolded. This time, she would carry a lantern of her own making. She told the voice she would think about it, that she would decide not from guilt or love's debt, but from a place that felt like truth. When the call ended, she stepped outside, the sun spilling across the street in wide strokes, and inhaled deeply. The world smelled of ripe mangoes from a nearby stall, of motor oil from a passing Okada, of the faint sweetness of the chrysanthemums behind her. Whatever she chose, it would be hers alone. In the weeks that followed, Clara found herself thinking less about the betrayal and more about the contours of her own resilience. She noticed things she might have overlooked before. The way the first customers of the morning carried a softer energy than the midday rush. How rain on tin roofs made her feel both rooted and light. The satisfaction in balancing a bouquet so that every stem had room to breathe. She didn't send the envelope on the counter back to its sender, but she didn't open it either. It became a quiet emblem of choice, a reminder that not every knock on the door deserved to be answered. The market women began to greet her more warmly again, slipping an extra sprig of mint into her bag just because. The small rituals of her days, sweeping the shop floor, folding away the cash at night, counting the blooms before closing, wove themselves into something solid enough to stand on. And in the evenings, when she sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching Lagos flex its restless muscles under the streetlights, she felt no need to name her piece for anyone else's understanding. She had kept her kidney, her dignity, and her name, and though life had not asked for her permission before throwing its test, she had answered in the only way that mattered, by choosing herself, fully and without apology. Somewhere beyond the hum of the city, the past still existed, but it no longer owned the keys to her door. In life, love should never blind you to the truth. Guard your heart, but guard your peace even more. No matter how deep your feelings run, remember that your worth is not measured by how much you give to those who break your trust. Choose yourself without guilt, because the right people will never make you doubt your value. May your heart never be a home for betrayal. May your trust never be traded for lies. May your name never be used where your feet have not walked. May you always have the wisdom to see through false smiles and the strength to walk away from hidden knives. May the doors you open lead to joy, and may every choice you make build your peace, protect your body, and honor your spirit. Your dignity will never be stolen, your blessings will never be diverted, and your kindness will only find those who cherish it. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.